Have you ever spent hours trying to replicate a specific type of film stock or a specific movie look that was shot on film, and you just, no matter what you do, can't seem to get it right? Well, today I'm going to be taking a look at Dehancer, which is a powerful film emulation plugin for DaVinci Resolve and other editors. And although they reached out to me for this review, they gave me the freedom to share my honest thoughts and opinions with y'all. So, spoiler alert, I really do love it, and I think it's a must-have for anybody trying to achieve that authentic film look. So let's get into the specifics of what make this plugin stand out, the areas it could improve, and my overall workflow with it. Also, if you're already thinking about getting Dehancer and you want a little discount, use the code Casey10 for 10% off of your purchase. After years of chasing the film look, even back in my Premiere Pro days, I always found it really tricky to replicate. Just slapping grain on top of footage is not going to sell the film aesthetic alone. And when I switched to DaVinci, the built-in color tools did help me get closer, but there was always just something missing. I think Dehancer fills that gap by adding some very authentic film characteristics like halation, bloom, grain, gate weave, and film breath in just ways that other tools can't. The grain, bloom, and halation are particularly impressive. They give your footage this organic, textured look that is usually extremely hard to achieve in other digital workflows. If you're buying Dehancer just for those features, I think it's well worth the investment. The film profiles also allow you to experiment with tons of different film stocks, which is another bonus for fine-tuning desired looks. So once you've added Dehancer to your footage, you're gonna have a bunch of different things that you can start to play around with. Input is gonna be the first tab, and it's gonna be where you select the color space you're working in. I use DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate because that's just how most of my node trees are set up, but if you're wanting to convert your straight out of camera footage, you can do that in the input section by selecting the choose camera option. This is all pretty straightforward as long as you know your camera's color and gamma profile. I don't like using this option though, as they don't seem to get the conversion right on both my Blackmagic and Lumix cameras. If you're new to color grading though, or you're a Premiere Pro user, this might be the best option for you. Also, if you're converting using a LUT, you should probably be using the Rec. 709 profile after you convert the footage. The same thing could be said if you're using an adjustment layer or if you're doing things on a full timeline node. I have a standard node tree that I use for almost every single project, and I start by applying first my camera input transforms, converting footage to DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate, and then later down the node tree, I will convert back to Rec. 709 and Gamma 2.4. From there, I'll drop Dehancer in between those two color space transforms. So a pro tip is stay in DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate, and then use those two CST nodes on the very end to stay in the widest color space. If you're a beginner, just add it after your conversion LUT and keep it in Rec. 709. This keeps your workflow simple and avoids some overwhelming issues you might run into with color spaces. One downside is when you're working with multiple clips and you need to tweak Dehancer settings for each one, it can get kind of tedious. I often just use an adjustment layer or apply Dehancer over the entire timeline to save time. This lets me make broader changes across all clips without copy and pasting nodes. There are some adjustments you can make within the input tab. I think these are mostly for Premiere and Final Cut users because there are things that you would just be doing in Resolve way before putting Dehancer on. Things like exposure, color temperature, and tint compensation. They work well, but there's really no need for them if you're working in Resolve. There's also a defringing option if you're using some older photo and vintage lenses and want to get rid of those purple-green hues that come out in those. This will really help when adding halation down the line. The film profiles in Dehancer are one of its best features. There's several motion picture film stocks to choose from, and I really like that they also have tons of stills film profiles as well, like the Cine Still and Kodak Portrait variants. These are really nice when I've been trying to mimic some of my favorite analog photographers. My all-out favorite though is going to be the Prokudin Gorsky 1906 experimental. I probably didn't say that right, but yeah, I just really love the colors and the saturation on that profile specifically. Push-pull is how the film reacts based on over or underexposure. If you adjust this, it's mainly going to affect your contrast and your saturation, but I usually don't mess with it. The Developer tab has options like Contrast Boost, which does what you would expect, boost or reduce contrast, Gamma Correction, which will adjust your midtones in relation to your highlights, Color Separation, if the film stock separation is too strong for your liking, and lastly, Color Boost, which is like saturation, but it's definitely giving different results than cranking a saturation slider. I like to use it sparingly, just slight touches to enhance the colors. Film compression mainly affects the highlights, helping you extract the dynamic range out of your footage, while the expand tab shifts the white and black points of your footage. These are going to be really useful, again, for anybody using Premiere or Final Cut, but I prefer doing these adjustments in other nodes within Resolve. Now the print tab is going to be where you can once again choose a film profile, but this will be a print. So it's trying to mimic the printing process of actual analog film. And I usually stick to the Kodak 2383 print profile, which gives that classic orange teal look. But there's other options like the Fujifilm prints or the glossy paper option. I don't mess with the target white or exposure options here, as I handle most of those adjustments earlier in the workflow. But what I will say is the target white has a nice temperature change without destroying your footage. The skin tones seem to stay intact, and it just gives pleasing results. Color density is kind of like subtractive saturation, where it will affect saturation without increasing the luminance values of the colors. It's really useful in a pinch, and the analog range limiter will just help with basically clipping values and will compress your image slightly. Color head is mostly going to be tint and tonal changes within the different levels. I do use these to tweak final outputs at times. It works really well for those of you also trying to create monochromatic looks or split tone looks. I will occasionally use the tone sliders to either add some warmth or coolness to the shadows and highlights, but that's pretty much it. So I see these as some of the weaker points of this plugin, but mainly due to the fact that I don't really touch anything other than the film and print sections. There are some useful tools in these sections, but if you're working in Resolve, they're mostly things that you would be doing before adding Dehancer. I do appreciate that they all have some kind of relation back to the actual analog development process of film, but they're not going to outshine or replace any abilities that you have within Resolve. If you're a Premiere or Final Cut user, I could see them being very valuable, but only because those programs just don't have nearly as powerful color grading tools compared to Resolve. The film grain in Dehancer is incredibly well done. It's generative and organic, offering lots of customization options. I often stick with the 35mm preset and just increase the intensity depending on the footage. The other presets are very nice as well. They mostly change size and frequency, but if you want to fine tune anything, there is a custom option that gives you full control over the parameters, including positive and negative options, which will give you more or less pronounced grain. Halation is another standout. So what's happening on an actual piece of film is that in areas of high contrast and brightness, there's a spill from the highlights into the surrounding crystals that make up the film. It shows up as a reddish orange glow that you can see around these areas. You can either use the built-in presets or fine-tune it yourself here, but again, I usually stick to one of the presets. I really like the no remjet options for both 35mm and 16mm, and then I usually just adjust them with the amplifier slider. The bloom effect gives your footage this nice, soft, dreamy feel just in the right places, and it's like using a Pro Mist filter on your lens. I try not to make this too powerful though, as it can really start to be overdone, just like some of the other effects. The bloom effect, just like halation and grain, also have a custom option. You can fine-tune all the parameters there. Bloom and halation are like the secret sauce to what makes a good film emulation, in my opinion. If you can get those two characteristics right, especially in combination with the realistic film grain that Dehancer has within the plugin, you're most of the way to a convincing film look. I really haven't used the custom options for these last three effects. The presets just do such a great job, and you can easily adjust the impact of them to how you like. The manual for Dehancer does say that bloom and halation should be used in tandem for the best results, and I couldn't agree more. Just halation can be overpowering in certain areas, and same with the bloom, but they both kind of soften each other out when you use them together. Film damage is a really nice effect to have, but if you're going for a cleaner look, it might be a little bit overkill. It looks genuine, but even in the 70mm preset, it's pretty pronounced. I personally like it, but I could see others not being too keen on it. If I'm going for a cleaner look, I usually just turn it down to -50 on the 35mm or the 70mm preset. Film breath is an effect that mimics the tiny variations in a film stock emulsion, and also just some of the physical process of the camera operation. This effect can be overdone. I usually stick to the built-in presets here because it can start to look like a flash rather than film breath and look extremely artificial. The Gate Weave tab simulates the slight jitter from imperfect film runs, adding another layer of authenticity. I do think it renders really good results, especially if you implement it well, but again, use it sparingly. I stick to the presets here as they perform really well right out of the gate. So the Overscan effect I do really like, but it could use some improvements. It's close, but not quite as gritty or real as I'd like it to be. A bit more imperfection would make it feel more like actual film. What I am doing here is adding a bit of halation around the edges, especially on the 8mm and 16mm presets with a power window, and then I just keyframe the opacity on it to make it seem a little bit more random. I typically avoid using Vignette and Dehancer, and I prefer doing that on a separate node. It is functional and it works, especially if you don't have access to other good Vignette tools, but I think just separating it makes for a cleaner and more manageable workflow in DaVinci. Output is going to be the final impact of Dehancer on your footage. Think of it as an opacity change, and I will say don't be afraid to dial anything back after you've done all of your adjustments. I often do. The monitor is nice if you don't like using waveforms. It's basically a false color monitor. There's also an option to generate LUTs right out of Dehancer if you're looking to do that as well. Options at the very bottom is going to allow you to change the quality. I usually recommend using high, but if you're working on a lower end machine, you might want to stick to normal. I did also want to mention that Dehancer has released an iOS version, and it works really well, similar to how the desktop plugin works. I let my girlfriend play around with it, and she got some really good results, so here's some before and afters. It does give you a bunch of preset options, which I think is something that they really need to add to the desktop version, but you can also just start with a clean slate. The thing I like most about it though is that it lets you export in like slower frame rates, just like some older cameras let you slow down the frame rate so you're not eating as much film. Let's talk about some of the drawbacks. First, Dehancer isn't a magic tool that makes any footage look great. You still need some solid color grading skills, and it won't fix just poorly shot or busted footage. Their built-in correction tools are underwhelming compared to DaVinci's native color grading features, and I always recommend doing your core corrections within DaVinci before applying Dehancer. Another weak point is the Overscan feature, which just doesn't quite nail the gritty imperfections of real film, and the Overscan borders feel too clean and there's no halation around their edges. I just don't think it quite sells the authenticity. Lastly, I think the color spaces for the choose your camera option are just off. They don't appear to be terribly off, but they're just missing some contrast and are a little bit flat. This was compared to both CST workflows as well as color managed workflows within DaVinci. So my final thoughts are Dehancer is a fantastic tool, especially if you're focused on grain, halation, and bloom effects. I think it does those particularly well. Its film profiles and print profiles are top-notch and give you a lot of flexibility to match different film stocks and create your own looks. However, it's not a one-stop shop for color grading, and you still need to do the bulk of your work in DaVinci before applying it. I guess if you're doing minimal workflows, you can use it, or if you're nailing your footage just like right out of camera, it can be used as one of those full one-step color grading tools, but color correcting your footage before using Dehancer is my recommendation. While there's a few weak points, mainly the overscan and correction tools, the overall package is really strong. And if you're serious about film emulation, Dehancer is well worth the investment. Let me know in the comments if you've used Dehancer and what your experience was like. And if you're thinking about getting Dehancer, be sure to use my code KC10 for 10% off your purchase. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and yeah, come back to the channel for more in-depth reviews and filmmaking tips, and we'll see you later.